So let's talk about the limbic system. What is it? Well, it's a set of structures in the brain, and many of those structures play an important role in regulating emotion. I'm going to talk very specifically about each area in the limbic system because if you're someone that understands emotions, as we all should, or if you're a counselor, it's really important to understand how the structures in the limbic system work. The limbic system is considered our emotional brain. Now, something that makes talking about the limbic system kind of confusing is that experts can't actually agree on which structures make up the entire limbic system. So for our purposes, we'll address some of the most important structures, the ones that everyone pretty much agrees are part of the limbic system. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty, so to speak, I want to give you a quick overview of what structures we're going to talk about and how you can easily remember these structures through this little cartoon of a hippopotamus, and he's wearing a hat. Now, why is this hippo wearing a cool hat? Well, it's my way of remembering the four most important components of the limbic system when it comes to emotion. So here's our hippopotamus, and he's wearing a hat. For this to be a mnemonic, it has to be something useful. The reason I think of a hippo in a hat is because these are the forming structures of the limbic system when it comes to emotion. H stands for hypothalamus, A for amygdala, T for thalamus, and hippo is short for hippocampus. These happen to be the four structures that I'd like to talk about. So let's move to a little more complicated diagram. Here's a decent attempt at drawing the limbic system. Limbic system structures sit on top of the brainstem, and here's your brainstem. Imagine as the very bottom of your brain, and here's your spinal cord coming out of the bottom portion of your brain, and the spinal cord goes all the way down your back, almost to your tailbone. Now the limbic system is made up of bright colored structures up here. To orient you to this diagram, this is what you would see if you pulled off the top of your brain, which is called the cortex, and it's facing in this direction. In other words, while this is not anatomically correct, let's say your eyes are here, your nose is here, and your mouth is here. Again, this is not anatomically correct, but this, as you can see, is the front and this is the back. This blue part here is called your thalamus. Think of the thalamus as a switchboard. The thalamus receives all sensory input and then disperses the sensory to different areas of the brain. So your thalamus functions as like a sensory relay station, meaning the things that you see, hear, taste, and touch, all of these senses come through your nerves and ultimately end up at your thalamus. And the thalamus directs these senses into the appropriate areas in the cortex, as well as other areas of the brain. Now you may have noticed there's one sense I haven't yet mentioned, and that is the sense of smell. Your sense of smell is the only sense that actually bypasses the thalamus, and instead your sense of smell has its own private relay station. Then when it comes through the nose, it goes to a certain area in the brain, and that area in the brain actually has to be very close to the other areas that regulate emotion, which explains why sometimes certain scents can evoke very powerful memories and bring you back to a certain moment in time. Now you see these two purple structures? This is known as the amygdala. If there's any part you should remember, please remember that part, because the amygdala is the one part of the brain that is probably the most impacted when using essential oils. The amygdala, sometimes called our emotional powerhouse, connects our emotions to our behavior and is responsible for detecting fear and preparing for emergency events. It helps us recognize emotion, like when someone looks angry, we recognize, oh, they look angry and they're upset with me. This is the part of the brain that's activated in recognition of emotion, as well as the processing of emotions, memories, responses to the environment, and motivation. It's where we do our emotional learning, and the amygdala stores our emotional memory and what we've learned. So any memory we have, good or bad, that evokes a significant emotion is stored here. Because of the amygdala's functions of recognizing, learning, and storing emotions, is why there have been so many studies done using the sense of smell and essential oils as a tool to access this portion of the brain and help us release past emotional traumas. So the amygdala is a really interesting area of the brain. The green structure you see curving around the thalamus is known as the hippocampus. The hippocampus plays a key role in forming new memories. It helps convert your short-term memory into long-term memory. I mention this in conversation because when you think back in your memories, whether it's short-term memory or long-term memory, these memories can invoke emotions as well. Memory is for sure a complex function of the brain. The things we've done, learned, and seen are first processed in the cortex. Then, if we sense it is important enough to remember permanently, it's passed inward to other regions of the brain, such as the hippocampus and amygdala, for long-term storage and retrieval. As these messages travel through the brain, they too create pathways that serve as the basis of our memory. Those memories are then associated with certain emotions which trigger various cascades of neurochemicals in our body. So, we actually cannot form a new memory without the hippocampus. It's very important for our factual memory as well. It's the first area that is damaged in the case of Alzheimer's, and it's a huge impact on our learning. This is why we're seeing a lot of studies come out now about how important smells are to learning and improving memory and retention. So the hippocampus is an important structure in forming long-term memories. So lastly, this orange structure. This orange structure is your hypothalamus. Hypo means below. So your hypothalamus is below your thalamus. So that's where it gets its name. The hypothalamus is actually a very tiny structure, and this diagram here really exaggerates the size of the hypothalamus. It's so small it actually makes up less than 1% of the total volume of your brain. It's about the size of a kidney bean. The hypothalamus is our command center. It's the big regulator and is at the center. Your hypothalamus is the busiest part of your brain. The hypothalamus plays an incredible role in regulating so many functions in your body, but for our purposes, we're talking about the limbic system structures in terms of emotion. So when it comes to emotion, think of your hypothalamus as regulating the autonomic nervous system, abbreviated as ANS. In the autonomic nervous system, you can think of it as fight or flight, your sympathetic nervous system, versus rest and digest, your parasympathetic nervous system. Think of it as regulating the autonomic nervous system. It does this by controlling the endocrine system by triggering the release of hormones into your bloodstream. It can secrete hormones, but in regard to hormones, it's actually more responsible for stimulating the anterior pituitary gland, which is the part of the brain responsible for actually releasing the hormones. Some of the hormones that are triggered to release are things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine is very commonly referred to as adrenaline. So if you ever think of the phrase adrenaline pumping through your veins, that's actually being regulated by your hypothalamus. It regulates our breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, sense of hunger, thirst, pain, and pleasure. Yes, the hypothalamus is also involved with regulating other basic drives like sleep and sex, but in terms of emotion, it's most important to note that it regulates the autonomic nervous system, that flight or fight response, or rest or digest response. Believe it or not, the hypothalamus helps us control our behavior and our expression of anger, as well as our happiness and sadness. So that's the limbic system, and these are the 4 basic structures: the thalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus. So these are the basic structures of your limbic system.